Perfect.
Got it.
Okay.
I like that background picture.
So Basul Wabanoke Wiik Mi'kmaq Ak Talawisi Tyler Everett. Greetings. I'm a person of the dawn and I am Mi'kmaq, and my name is Tyler Everett. Thank you all for joining us today for the 4th webinar in the USET Forest and Wetland Webinar Training Series. I'm the Forest Adaptation Technical Assistant with United South and Eastern Tribes, or USET, and I will be hosting today's webinar. Today's webinar is being recorded, as Casey just queued up. And once the recording's done being processed, I'll put it up on the USET YouTube page, and you can feel free to share that with other employees who weren't able to make the call today, or other folks you think could get value out of today's webinar session. And I'll share that link with everybody who's registered for the webinar in a follow-up email, which you guys probably all been receiving from me thus far in the series. So before we get started, I wanted to pass it over to other USET staff on the call, just to give themselves the opportunity to introduce themselves, what they do at USET, and they'll be helping kind of support today's webinar. So I'll pass it off to Casey.
Thank you, Tyler. Winikisat, Nataswis Casey Thornbrook on the Thomas Massipia. Good day, everyone. My name is Casey Thornbrook, and I'm a citizen of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. I live and work remotely from my home in Mashpee on Cape Cod, Massachusetts, on the East Coast. And I serve as the program manager and tribal climate science liaison with United South and Eastern Tribes, USET. This webinar series, very excited about it. We're kind of in the middle part of it. It was funded by a Bureau of Indian Affairs Tribal Resilience Grant, opportunities for tribal organizations and tribal nations. We actually wrote this in the kind of in the midst of the pandemic, and thought about how we can present this information and get as close to site visits as possible in a virtual space. So we're really excited to be able to do so, and want to acknowledge Tyler and his exceptional work in pulling these things together. I'm scanning the participant list, and I think, Tyler, you and I are the only folks from USET on right now, from USET staff, that is, on right now. So I will kick it back over to the introductions, back over to you.
Yeah, I think you're right. I don't see any other USET staff on the call. So thank you, Casey. But I do want to give an opportunity to any tribal departmental staff that are joining the webinar session for the first time today, or haven't had the opportunity to introduce themselves to the group. I want to give you guys the opportunity now to present yourself. So if you're tribal department staff and haven't had the opportunity to introduce yourself, now would be the time to do so. So you can unmute yourself and turn your camera on if you have that capability, and go ahead and give your introduction.
Hey everyone, my name is Rainey Tatro. I'm the lead lab tech here at Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, and this is the first webinar in this series that I have attended, so super excited.
Thank you for joining, Rainey. And if you wanted to register for the webinar on the USET webpage, I can throw the link into the chat here shortly, and then you can gain access to all of the recording or recorded webinars in the session, or in the series rather.
That would be great, Tyler. Thanks so much.
No problem. Thanks for joining. Are there any other tribal departmental staff on the call that would like to introduce themselves? Okay, So hearing none, I want to still give the opportunity to anyone that's presenting today to introduce themselves. So I'll go in order of the agenda, which I'll get to. Adam Tarando, if you want to give yourself an introduction.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Adam Tarando, and glad to be here. I'm with the U.S. Geological Survey with the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, and be kind of appropriate for my talk today because right now it's just pouring down rain outside with some really heavy precipitation. So that's a little foreshadowing for what I'll be talking about. Great to be here.
Thank you, Adam. It's great to have you here. Next, we'll hear from some folks involved in some work with Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. Heather Gregory, do you want to give yourself an introduction?
Sure. My name is Heather Gregory. I am the environmental laboratory technician and the wetlands program manager here at the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, and I'm excited to be here.
Thanks, Heather. We're excited to have you here. I'll pass it now to Joanne McCoy.
Hi, I'm Joanne McCoy. I'm working with Heather and the Eastern Band of Cherokee to help them develop a herbarium and also a seed bank. And I've been working with them for the last 10 years on numerous projects. And I've been a plant collector for about the last 15 years. I was the medicinal plant collector for the National Plant Germplasm System for the USDA. And then I've also was director of research at the North Carolina Arboretum, developing a seed bank and an herbarium. So developing seed banks and herbariums, I think, is a very important thing right now with climate change broaching. And I'm looking forward to the project with Cherokee.
Thank you, Joanne. And then we have a joint presentation with the Tribal Adaptation Menu Team and NIAX. And so Bazil Pennick, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Tyler. Bonjour, everybody. My name is Bazil Panik. I am the current Tribal Climate Adaptation Menu Coordinator at the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. So up in the Great Lakes region. And yeah, today I'm going to be talking about our tribal adaptation menu, and I'm excited to hear from you all as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Bazil. And Patricia Leopold.
Hi, everybody. It's an honor to be here with you today. I'm an adaptation specialist with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. I'm based in the Keweenaw Peninsula of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and I've been working with some tribes on incorporating climate change into land stewardship using tools like the adaptation workbook and the tribal adaptation menu, which I'll be talking more about later today.
Thank you, Patricia. And I think that's everyone that's for introductions. So now, in the interest of time, I ask anyone that hasn't had the opportunity to introduce themselves and still hasn't to go ahead and put your name, your title, the organization or tribal nation that you work for in the chat and introduce yourself in the chat feature. All right, so this is the loyalty card checklist document. I have touched on this in the other webinars, and if you're wondering how to navigate this document and earn one of the 3 loyalty incentive packages, you can reference the recordings to webinars 1 and 2. But just to give you the gist of what it's all about, you can complete the tasks and writing reflections here on this document, and I'll check them off in my records. And as you check them off, it moves you one step closer to earning one of those incentive packages. Like I said, I have like a binder here with everyone's name and their registration for the webinar series, and I'll check it off as we go. If you haven't registered, I know that some people maybe on the call receive the link through an email. If you want to register for the webinar, I'll make you another document or a checklist document in my files, and You can even go back and watch the recordings and send me writing reflections for those ones, and different tasks to get them checked off. And I'll retroactively check them off for you so you can still work toward making or earning one of those incentive packages. At each webinar, you all get 2 opportunities to check off the first task, which is just sharing a reflection with the group. I'll call for these at the beginning and at the end of each webinar. Any reflection will do. It can be about any of the webinars in the series. It could just be a reflection about what you're currently working on with your tribal nation, or even a reflection about the virtual site visits that we've gone on so far in this webinar series. I think sharing like this will help kind of foster good connections among the group and start to form a working group, if you will. And I'll keep track of these reflections that are shared. So right now I'd like to open it up to open the floor to anyone that would like to share a reflection so far about the webinar series, connections you've made, maybe a webinar or a fact or something you learned from a webinar that really stuck out. Anyone that would like to share a reflection, go ahead and do so now. I see that Emily Francis has her hand up. Go ahead, Emily.
Hi, I was just going to put my information about myself into the chat. I am a PhD candidate with Tyler, and I have no tribal affiliation. But I am working on the ash and emerald ash borer issue here in Maine at the University of Maine. And I've enjoyed all the talks so far, but I really enjoyed the vernal pool talk, specifically talking about creating vernal pools, like man-made vernal pools and moving vernal pools, and some of those things I'd never considered or thought of before. So I thought that was really cool to have Dr. Calhoun talk about those options for a very important environmental resource. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Emily. I enjoyed that webinar too. I really like vernal pools. They're a really wonderful wetland space. Any other reflections that someone would like to share? Okay, we'll move on in the interest of time. There'll be an opportunity to share a reflection at the end of the webinar as well. But yes, anytime that you have a reflection to share, please feel free to share it with the group. I encourage you to do so. In addition to sharing a reflection live, there are also free writing reflections specific to this webinar that you could type up and send to me in an email. You can email those to teverett@usetinc.org. And so let's get a little closer look at these writing reflections. So the first of those 3 reflections is simply emailing me your response to how you would finish the sentence. One thing I learned from today's webinar was, it doesn't need to be very in-depth. It can just be a short and sweet statement. I've gotten some really great reflections so far emailed to me. It's been really great. I know that when I join these webinars, it's good to write stuff down so you don't forget it. I always forget it. So that's an opportunity to do that. Number 2 is in the presentations by Heather Gregory and Joanne McCoy about the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians Wetlands Project. Joanne and Heather introduce a wetland plants herbarium project with big aspirations. What can a plant herbarium project like the one shared do to support climate resilience and wetland restoration projects? So that's the first writing reflection to kind of keep in mind during today's presentations. And then the third is in follow-up to the presentations by the Tribal Adaptation Menu Team and NIACS. Do you have a project that you think could benefit from using the adaptation menus that were shared? If so, what project and which adaptation menu do you think would be a good fit? And so maybe we'll get a little bit more context to that question when we get to that presentation, but another writing reflection to keep in mind today during the webinar session. So here's a quick look at the agenda. I'm finishing up the introduction, welcome, and then we're going to jump to a presentation by Dr. Adam Tarando on regional climate impacts to consider for wetland restoration in Southern Appalachia. Then we have two presentations by Heather Gregory and Joanne McCoy on some wetlands work with the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. Then we have a presentation by the Tribal Adaptation Menu team and on other climate adaptation menus from Bazil Panik and Patricia Leopold with NIAX. Then I'll take and put all of those that presented today on a panel. I'll pin everybody up on the screen so we can ask them questions about what they presented on. And then we'll finish up with a writing reflection exercise at the end. So without further ado, I'm gonna pass it on to our first presentation, Dr. Adam Tarando, a research ecologist with USGS, to present about regional climate impacts to consider for wetland restoration in Southern Appalachia. The floor is yours, Adam.
Great. Thanks, Tyler. Bring this up. Okay. And I always need to take a second to move all of your nice pictures of yourselves so I can see my talk. Let's see. There we go. Got it. Okay. Thanks very much for inviting me, and hopefully this will be useful, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Like I said, my name is Adam Tarando. I'm with the U.S. Geological Survey, and so I'm with this group called the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. We're located mainly in Raleigh, and we cover work research in the Southeast U.S. and the U.S. Caribbean, and our focus is mainly on science to help understand and then adapt to changing climate, particularly as it affects fish, wildlife, water, land, and people. And so given that, the Southeast is really this amazing place to work. It's just landscape that's really rich in biodiversity, especially when you think about relative to a lot of areas in the US, there's all these endemic species across different taxa. And so thinking about how climate change could affect all these species, and again, particularly in the context of wetlands and wetland restoration in the Southern Appalachians, it's a really critical to think about these things, because there are a lot of just special places and special animals, special trees, special plants in this area. Just so they're all on the same page, I do like to show this to give us a little bit longer perspective on what humans are doing to the climate. So this is going to be showing carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, and on the left, it's showing the amount of carbon dioxide measured over different parts of the globe. So you can see that rising over time. We're going through time, and on the right, it's the single time series at basically our best measurement location, which is in Hawaii. And so you see there, it's 1999, 2000. You can see this rising amount of CO2. And this video is actually called like a pump handle, because it kind of looks like a water pump going up and down as trees, primarily in the Northern Hemisphere, where most of the land mass is, take up more carbon dioxide in the growing season. So now we're going to go back in time, though, and you can really see that trend as where the Industrial Revolution began in the mid 1700s. And as we keep going back with more proxy records of carbon dioxide that are trapped in little bubbles of ice, now we're changing the scale to thousands of years. So we're going back through the ice ages, 100,000, 400,000, 800,000 years into the past. And you really get a sense of how this is really more of a instantaneous sort of bomb of carbon dioxide that's been released in the atmosphere all at once. And of course, this affects the climate, because the more carbon dioxide and the more greenhouse gas in the environment, in the atmosphere, the more energy that is sort of able to be retained near the Earth's surface, and that will warm up the planet. So carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is now likely higher than at any point in at least the last 2 million years. Okay, so if we're thinking about perspectives on ecosystem time or even geologic time, this is really an unprecedented increase, and it's been in terms of ecosystem time or geologic time, it's really a blink of an eye. But really, you can also, there's all sorts of effects of this this changes that humans are bringing to the climate. But you can also think about just 3 big changes. That's how I kind of like to boil it down. 1, it gets warmer. 2, it rains harder. And 3, the seas rise. So briefly on that first one, as it gets warmer, this is the one we're probably all more familiar with. So we've now we have strong enough evidence to say confidently that the rate of warming is unprecedented in at least the last 2,000 years, and it could be much longer than that. And this could be the warmest multi-century period we've had within the last 100,000 years. So that's what this graph on the left is showing, the rate of temperature increases globally. And on the right, it's just showing the comparison when you look at the observed temperature, since we've had really good measurements with thermometers in the last 150 to 200 years, what that looks like, and then how our climate models are able to replicate that trend and that change in temperature. They can only replicate it when they include the greenhouse gases that humans have included in the atmosphere. The blue line and blue shading below that is when you don't include greenhouse gases due to human burning of fossil fuels. So that's really the only way we can explain what's going on. And so it gets warmer. This is one way to look at that. Just one simple way I picked is looking at the ratio of daily temperature records. So 7 to 1 means there's 7 times as many daily record high temperatures as there are daily record low temperatures. So if the climate was not changing, it was just kind of staying the same, this would be a very boring figure, because the rate of record highs and record lows, the ratio of those two should be 1 to 1. It should be equal, but you can see they're not. We're getting more and more daily record highs as the planet warms. Okay, but I really want to focus on this second one, the fact that it rains harder, as the big change as the planet warms. Why does it rain harder? Well, a warmer atmosphere will have more water vapor in it, simply put. This is something called the Clausius-Clapeyron relation. So if you look at the figure on the right, on the bottom axis is temperature. In this case, it's in degrees Celsius. And on the vertical axis is vapor pressure. And so that's the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere. And you can see that as the temperature increases, it's not a linear relation. It's more like an exponential relation where you get about 7% increase in the amount of water vapor on average in the atmosphere for every degree Celsius of warming. Okay. And so then what that translates into is actually typically a lot more extreme precipitation events, or heavier, more rainfall when you do get heavier precipitation events. So on the left, this is what's showing that, where the frequency and increase in intensity of heavy one-day precipitation events that have about a 10% chance of occurring every year in the past, say 1850 to 1900, those now occur, since we've already had about 1 degree Celsius of warming, those events occur now about 30% more frequently now than they did in the past. And you get about 7% more rainfall when you do have those really heavy precipitation events. So they're happening more frequently, and they're more intense as well. And depending on how much warming we have in the future, That's what's showing here on the left with future global warming levels, 1.5, 2, or 4 degrees Celsius. You can see then how much more common those types of events are likely to become and how much more precipitation you are likely to get in those really intense rainstorms. So hopefully you can see the through line I'm drawing here is that can have some pretty important implications for hydrology and when you're thinking about wetlands and wetland restoration and really the critical importance of wetlands to helping to slow down and think about or slow down and help reduce the impact of this type of heavy precipitation event. So we are already seeing these changes. So these hexagons represent big regional areas across the globe. They kind of sort of looks like continents if you squint your eyes. So ENA on the left is Eastern North America. And so climate change is already affecting every inhabited region across the globe. And we see this with heavy precipitation. So we've observed increases in heavy precipitation in our region of North America. And we have, it's not super high confidence that these trends have really emerged out of like, say, the noise of just what happens normally every year. But I think the lines of evidence are rapidly converging that we are seeing these increases in heavy precipitation already in our region. So this is a similar figure, just zooming into the United States, and it shows that the frequency of heavy precipitation events, in this case, the amount of precipitation occurring over 2 days every 5 years, or with a chance of occurring once every 5 years, you can see that that's increased by 58% in the last. In this case, this is over the last century or so. Now, what's interesting is that in terms of average precipitation, it's very unclear which way that would go. If overall during the year, we might get more or less precipitation. Of course, I'm going to preface all of this by saying all of this depends on how much more greenhouse gases we put into the atmosphere over time. But, stipulating that, it's still kind of unclear if precipitation overall would be more or less in the future. But again, what we do have much higher confidence in, pretty high certainty, is that even if, say, the amount of precipitation decreased somewhat in the future in our region, the number and the intensity of heavy precipitation events, intense storms, will increase. Okay, and that's part of that Clausius-Clapeyron physical relation again. We basically are just moving into a warmer atmosphere is kind of a juicier atmosphere, and it's able to produce more intense rainstorms when conditions are right for precipitation. So, summarizing that really quickly, maybe fewer showers and more deluges in the future. One quick aside on that, what about hurricanes? That's pretty important in the Southern Appalachians. So here, for example, this was just from last year, from when Tropical Storm Fred moved through. You can see that some areas in the mountains were getting about 15 inches of rain over a couple day period. And so, everyone on this call realizes that the Southern Appalachians are, these tropical storms become really important for flooding. And so again, and then this is showing Hurricane Florence, which didn't hit the mountains quite as much as down on the coast, but there were some places around Wilmington and that were could have received up to 50 inches of rain just from this one storm. And then you get scenes like this, which was I-40 turned into a canal after that rain event. So it wasn't even the wind or storm surge that was so terrible with that storm. It was the amount of water that just fell and the slow speed at which the storm went through, and it just dumped and dumped and dumped. So overall, with tropical storms, what we expect is there's a couple of different factors that some move towards maybe making it conditions more favorable for hurricanes, and another couple factors that make it less favorable for hurricanes. But overall, that means maybe the frequency of the storms may not change much, but we do expect that when hurricanes do occur, it's a higher chance that they'll be stronger. And so we can think about that through the future, that when hurricanes do form, by the time they get to the mountains, they may be more powerful and have more rain left to rain out over the mountains. And so we're likely already starting to see the effects of this. So this is an example from Hurricane Harvey a few years ago, if you remember that, where Houston, Texas in particular, really got dumped on with 20, 30 inches of rain or more in the region. And so using some statistical models, the scientists were able to show that climate change likely increased the total amount of precipitation. Human influenced climate change likely increased the total amounts of precipitation by about 40%. And that's coincident with this trend we're also seeing, where tropical cyclone forward speeds seem to be decreasing, which again is really not great news when you're talking about really heavy precipitation events. So that's one thing we're watching out for. All right, just finishing up on this part, what about droughts? That's something obviously we're thinking about when really critical for wetlands in terms of that hydro period and seasonal flooding. Overall, there's still a bit of uncertainty. Globally, the planet will likely be a bit wetter. Again, that going back to that Clausius-Clapeyron relation. But not all regions will be wetter, and some areas we will expect to dry. And you can see those in the map of the globe here. You can see the areas that are potentially projected to dry in the future as the planet warms. And so that's about all we can say right now, is that there's not a lot of clarity on that. Again, because the planet will be warmer, one thing we might expect is that when a drought does occur, it could be worse, because you will have a more evapotranspiration, a thirstier atmosphere, and so it might be more intense droughts when droughts do occur. Okay, so putting this together and thinking about what does this mean, say for ecosystem transformation, and in particular in the Southern Appalachians. Well, overall, a lot of areas, natural ecosystems will be transformed. So this is obviously not the Appalachians, but still thinking about our region where we are seeing this sort of transformation occurring, switching these sort of ecosystem state changes, where this is a wetlands figure. So thinking about these saltwater marshes transitioning into mangroves. This is a really interesting transformation that's occurring in some regions, say around Louisiana and Florida right now, where mangroves are very cold sensitive, and they have a really well-established cold temperature tolerance, where they, if the temperature gets consistently below about 10 or 15 degrees Fahrenheit in the winter for several nights a year, they just can't survive. And if that happens, even just like once in a 20-year event, the mangroves will die back, and conditions are much more favorable for salt marsh. But of course, as the climate warms, those really cold events become rarer and rarer until in some places they just stop occurring. And you can get this pretty rapid transformation from one whole type of ecosystem to a different one. So this is some work that I do in the Southeast. This is not related to wetlands per se, but thinking about fire potential. But it's still relevant to thinking about this idea of ecosystem transformation. So this is showing like burn probabilities. I'm not going to get into details of this, but you can think about in the center picture there, thinking about the Southern Blue Ridge Appalachian Mountains. And as the temperatures change and precipitation changes, depending on how much warmer things become, you can really start to think about these ecosystem transformations and having whole system transformations. And you might get a whole different type of assemblage of species, depending on their tolerances for those changes in temperature and precipitation. So just wanted to flag that. And so some areas we're mapping these as like climate analogs. So thinking about like, what do certain ecosystems look like today, even considering like how humans have the human influence on those ecosystems. which ones might be a little bit more similar to different trajectories of ecosystem change in the future. Okay, so that's thinking about the climate. I wanted to add in one more complication to thinking about considerations for wetland restoration, and that's that people are moving here fast. This is a very popular region. So you can see on the right, that's the projected percentage change in population over the next several decades. And you can kind of map out the dark blue colors are the higher projected increases in population. The yellows and oranges are projected decreases. And you can see those high population gain regions are, not surprisingly, along the beach in Florida, where there's warm winters. In the Piedmont, where there's a lot of jobs, you can see that corridor from Raleigh to Atlanta, which I'll talk about in a bit. But also the Southern Appalachians. It's a really high amenity area, and there's a large demand for people to move there or retire there, build a vacation house there. You know this, you live there, you are living through it. So we have a favorable climate for now. And now the air conditioning is widely available in the Southeast. That's driving just a ton of migration to the area, but also a lot of internal migration throughout the Southeast now, where you are getting people from Florida. There's just so many people in Florida now that it's what we call a source population, and people are moving out of Florida, or say, again, if they're high wealth individuals purchasing vacation homes, particularly in the mountains, if things just get too hot down on the coast. But what does this growth look like? That's the other part of it, and thinking through about how this affects wetlands. Well, in our region, really urbanization is suburbanization. So when you think about people moving here, and in the Southeast, we have really low density development. It's oriented around cars. It's not typically oriented around walking or public transit or any other mode of transportation. And so that means it takes up a lot of room, because cars, if you think about the size of a car relative to the size of the human, you just have to scale that to the size of the car, and all of our cities therefore are scaled to that. And so that means we take up a lot more room. And what happens if we keep that up? And so this was a modeling study we did, simulating different urbanization patterns over the next several decades, and you can see how that pattern changes over time, and could really be a large increase in suburban development if our recent trends sort of continued into the future. So zooming into the Southern Appalachians, you can really see how that growth just kind of explodes again as people move to the mountains and all the amenities that it offers. So those projections then translate into large-scale habitat loss, and increases in habitat fragmentation as well. So it becomes harder to sort of stitch pieces together or keep different habitat corridors intact as this development occurs. And of course, this car-focused development forces changes to the natural hydrology of an area, where it really increases flood risk, because now you have much more impervious surface, which really affects the how quickly that water tries to will drain away, because you don't have these softer landscapes and surfaces, things like wetlands, to slow it down. So wrapping up here, can we adapt? Well, that's sort of the open question, right? And I'm sure that I know the next talks will be talking about these sorts of things a lot more. But there are different approaches to adaptation. There's one called building resilience. There's that's the one that's sort of taken hold, or has been the standard for the last couple of decades. But there's this new one where we're thinking more about managing with change, and that's this new framework called RAD, or Resist, Accept, Direct, and that's on the right here, where you're sort of breaking down the decision matrix into these three very basic ways that you could deal or start to adapt to climate change. You could try to resist the changes and keep their ecosystems the way they are, and that can be totally appropriate for a given context. You can sort of accept the changes and that's sort of that ecosystem transformation. So that example of, say, the salt marsh to the mangrove, and just sort of even facilitate those changes if those are aligning with what you're trying to do. Or you can try to direct the changes into a certain trajectory that you think might be a better fit for your values and for the system and for what's to come with the climate. Okay, so a couple of resources for where to go to learn more about regional climate change effects, both now and the future. The best source, I think, still is the National Climate Assessment, the U.S. National Climate Assessment. There's a couple volumes. This is supposed to be produced every 4 years. Sometimes that deadline slips, but lately we've been doing a pretty good job at that. And so the National Climate Assessment is established by an act of Congress, supposed to be delivered every 4 years, and it assesses the current findings about global change and climate change effects on the nation now and in the future. And there's a whole chapter dedicated just to the Southeast if you want to learn more about that. The next one will be published in 2023, so that will be coming out in the not too distant future. All right, and finally, if you want quick access to climate change information and say like some types of similar maps to the ones I've been showing, this is a really good one. This is called the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit. There you can see the website there. Lots of things to explore on here, but you can also like zoom in and just really quickly and easily just kind of create your own maps with different options. This one's called the Climate Explorer. And so you can see here I'm showing the projected number of days with high temperatures above 90 degrees Fahrenheit in the 2050s. So, 30 years from now. And on the left is showing if we reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and on the right is showing if we keep emitting the same amount of greenhouse gas emissions as we are now into the future, or keep increasing them. And so there's some really interesting things that can pop up when you do these sorts of analyses. So again, on the left is lower greenhouse gas emissions by the 2050s, and on the right is higher greenhouse gas emissions. This is showing for total precipitation for the year. And then this is where you start to see some really interesting and where the uncertainty pops up. So I'm just going to draw your eyes. Again, I'm showing different seasons. So you see spring, summer, fall, winter. And then, but what's really interesting is in fall and winter, it sort of flips in terms of projected changes in precipitation. Where is it projected to be wetter or drier? If in one scenario with lower greenhouse gas emissions, it's wetter in the fall, and then drier in the winter. But with more greenhouse gas emissions, it's drier in the fall and wetter in the winter. So that's the sort of things that you probably need to start thinking about and keeping in mind when you're thinking about wetland restoration and planning for the future, is that type of uncertainty in terms of like, what do hydro periods start to look like in the future? Is this a type of wetland that can handle that kind of changes in the seasonality of precipitation? Okay. So that is all I have. In interest of time, I'll just say thank you very much, and I'm happy to do any questions now, or we can wait till the panel at the end. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Adam Turanda. That was great. I really like the RAD framework, and thinking about the urbanization, I think we're gonna want to do a resist there and keep forests. But the RAD framework is a good way of thinking. I like that. In the interest of time, why don't we look for one question from the group? You need to put that in the chat or unmute yourself and ask it directly to Adam, and then we'll move on to the next presentation. And then, of course, any question you have that we don't get to answer right now, we can ask Adam on the panel at the end of the webinar. Check the chat real quick.
Again, feel free to ask, email me. I'll put my email in the chat too, if you have any questions you want to follow up with.
Awesome. Thank you, Adam.
Thanks.
So seeing no questions, I'm sure give it some thought. We'll have some ready for Adam on the panel. And so now I'm going to pass it along to the next presenter on our agenda. We're going to start first with Heather Gregory, correct? Is that right, Heather?
Yes, that is right.
Okay. So I will, you have screen sharing ability, but I do have your presentation on my computer if you'd rather me flip through.
I think I could probably share my screen.
Okay. The floor is yours, Heather. Thank you.
Okay, there we go. So I'm Heather Gregory. Like I said before, I am with the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, and I am the Wetlands Program Manager. Our Wetlands Program is technically still under development. We started in FY17, and we were working at that time on getting a quality assurance project plan approved, which was finally approved in January of 2020. We've been the recipient of the Wetland Program Development Grant since FY17. And with the help of USAT, we had a wetlands program plan written and approved with the help of Colin, who I don't think is there anymore. And there was previous work done on wetlands. It was before I came to work here. One of them was in 2005 and the other was in 2009, where they delineated the wetlands that were within the Qualla boundary, which is just basically just within the reservation. And it was necessary when we started, after we got our QAP approved, then we were able to start the work. We went out and verified that these sites were still there and that they're still viable. And at that time, we were using the Army Corps, their manual to do this. That was before we got I got certified to do the North Carolina Wetland Assessment Method, which I'll just call it NCWAM right now, to assess the wetland conditions. I went through a training for that was sponsored by the NC Association of Environmental Professionals. And the work that we're doing now is in Graham and Cherokee County, North Carolina, where we hired a contractor from First Nations, and he identified the new wetland sites in Graham and Cherokee counties. And we are in the process of creating an herbarium, which we're going to catalog the species of plants that we collected from several sites in Graham and Cherokee counties, which Joanne McCoy will talk more about after I'm done. We're still purchasing some of the equipment and the supplies needed for the herbarium project. And we're also going to be starting a seed bank using a low temperature freezer to store the plant seeds in, so that in the future we can propagate these specimens and use them in future restoration work. And excuse me, the seeds that can be propagated in the future, we're going to build a greenhouse, and hopefully we'll be doing that within the next fiscal year in order to store and grow these plants. And that'll be used in the future restoration work using native plants. And the verifications of wetland status were initially performed in Graham and Cherokee counties, like I said, using the Army Corps manual. But now that I've become certified to use NCWAM, I'm going to go back out and I'm going to look at these sites again. So according to the people that wrote the NCWAM, the manual, it's an accurate, consistent, rapid, observational, and scientifically based field method to determine the function of a wetland. And it's got, North Carolina itself has 16 different wetland types. Using NCWAM shouldn't take you maybe but 15 minutes in order to perform it. It considers chemical, physical, and biological functions for the wetlands. And like I said, there's 16 general wetland types, and it gives functional ratings for each assessment area within a wetland type in comparison to a reference wetland. These are the wetland types. I won't go through all of them, but the ones I highlighted in red are generally more common to this area than the others, which are common in other parts of the state. So using NCWAM, there's the 3 major functions: hydrology, water quality, and habitat. And speaking of climate change, that can have a big impact on some of the plants and the other, not just plants, but any living organism that's growing there. Cherokee itself is known for our trout, our fishing, and trout do not like warm water. So if the temperatures keep increasing and the water temperatures increase, which I've noticed a few times, it's gone over what they consider the limit, then we will have a problem. There are sub-functions and functions that are evaluated using 22 field metrics. I'm not going to go into all of those because there's a lot of them, but I will put I'll put the link, if anybody is interested, to the NCWAM manual and the dichotomous key and the functional rating form. I'll put that in the chat. So we will be once we get all of our data, we will be incorporating it into software called Aquarius. Right now, Aquarius is still, the people that do Aquarius are developing a database just specifically for us to use, but they're still in the process of doing that. So once they're done with that, then we can put that in there and it will be available to anybody that wants to see it, whether you work for the tribe or not. Say, you want to do some construction, you can go on there and you can look and see if there's a wetland there. So some work to still be done. We're going to be building that greenhouse facility, hopefully this coming fiscal year, and performing the functionality assessments on all of the newly found wetland sites that First Nations located in Graham and Cherokee counties using the NCWAM method. We'll be taking more plant specimens from these areas, and Joanne will be analyzing those, and then we'll mount them and put them in the herbarium, and we'll take the seeds and we'll put them in the seed bank, which Joanne is going to train us on how to do that starting this next fiscal year. And in the future, start long-term monitoring for wetland extent, condition, and performance. This is a step towards a fully functional wetlands program. Like I said, we're still under development right now. And this will make it so that the wetlands are managed better and hopefully will increase their functionality within their ecosystems. And the data can be used for modeling potential hydrologic change, ecosystem biogeographic shifts, wetland losses or increases. And in the future, we will likely be considering mitigation banking. So that is all I've got. And I will hand it over to Joanne. How do I stop sharing my screen? Oh, there it is.
There you go.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Heather. That was
You're
great.
welcome.
Yeah, I'm interested to read the NCWAM manual and see how it kind of varies from
Yeah, I'm gonna put that in there right now.
Yeah. So without in the interest of time, I'm gonna share Joanne's presentation. Once I have it up, Joanne, the floor will be yours to share.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. And
Okay.
there we go. Is everybody seeing the slides?
I can see them.
Okay, so this talk will be about developing the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians water quality herbarium for the long-term conservation of native and traditional species. So I'm working with Heather and the Cherokee to develop an herbarium specifically for the wetland species, and then also we'll be developing a seed bank for the long-term storage of many of these seeds, so that in the future, if climate change does do what we're afraid it might do, we will be able to replant with the exact same genetic strains that were there before. Okay, next slide. So first of all, what exactly is an herbarium? I think everybody probably knows, but we'll just go through the definition. It's a collection of preserved plant specimens and their associated data used for scientific and conservation study. The specimens can be whole plants or plant parts, usually in dried form, mounted on paper, stored in boxes, or kept in alcohol. It's considered best practice to use archival quality material when possible. So the label paper, the herbarium sheets, the folders, the genus covers, the DNA packets, the glue, all need to be archival quality. And we use acid-free mounting paper even because that slows specimen degradation. So everything we do for all of the supplies are to last for hundreds of years in the future. So that's what archival quality is. Okay. Next slide. The herbarium mission, long-term mission, will be the conservation of native and traditionally used heirloom and wetland plant species through collection, acquisition, and long-term storage. Utilizing best management practices by long-term maintenance of the collection will be recording and managing all data associated, including passport, characterization, evaluation, inventory, and distribution for the effective utilization of the collection. And the herbarium is going to be very valuable because we're going to focus specifically on wetlands around the Cherokee Reservation. So we'll be able to mark what is there now and see with climate change how those get affected in the future, and then to store those long term in case we need to replant in the future or regenerate some of these species because of climate change issues. Okay, next slide. Collection equipment and supplies for developing an herbarium. A plant press is one of the most important things, and we can buy those in a kit now. Instead of buying them separate, you can get it all together. A GPS is necessary, a global positioning system, obviously. Also, a plant dryer or a dehumidifier to dry the samples. Pruning shears, because sometimes you have to get a branch of a tree. Garden trowels, because sometimes you have to dig up roots when you're collecting the specimens. And also a clipboard with waterproof paper set up with a data sheet to fill in all of the data. So the data collected for every single accession include elevation, aspect, slope, associated species, of course, the date, the genus, species, elevation, aspect, slope, all sorts of data is collected so that we can go and recollect at the exact same site in the future if we need to replant or propagate or save a species that might be getting wiped out. We're seeing a lot of poaching when we go collect and recollect, and that's getting a little bit disturbing because usually wetland plants have been ignored, but we're beginning to see poaching in wetlands, which is really quite disturbing. The companies that supply these collection equipment for the herbarium are Herbarium Supply Company, Forestry Suppliers, Carolina Biological Supplies, and they all have websites, and they have all of the equipment necessary for a lot of this. And one thing I want to mention also is that for other future research projects, many publications now and university studies are requiring herbarium specimens to prove this plant species when a plant study is done, whether it be propagation or chemical analysis or agricultural production. The voucher specimens are becoming an important part of research so that you can say, when you publish the paper, you can say, this accession number 6275 was used for this study. And then it's there in the future if anybody wants to question it or prove it, or even submit and do the same experiment over again. Okay, next slide. These are some of the archival quality products that are required for an herbarium. And one of the most important is the upper left, the archival glue. This is purchased. This has to be purchased specially, and everything is archival because that means that it's going to last for hundreds of years in an herbarium cabinet. And it's actually very, very important for the long-term storage of these specimens. The archival glue comes in half-gallon or gallon containers, so it's necessary to purchase these glue bottles with the pointed nozzle, and that's so that you can glue down intricate species of the specimens. The FTA plant card, that's a DNA plant saver card. Those are actually incredibly valuable for relatively recent research, and you rub the leaf onto the FTA plant card and you could get 4 samples of DNA, and they last a long time. And then in order to do a DNA study, all someone has to do is get a hole punch of that FTA plant card, and the DNA is saved indefinitely. And they're actually very successful. And then also the envelopes, these are to, on each herbarium specimen, you want to have a piece, you want seed or stems or leaf material to help identify the species. And then down here in the lower right, this is archival quality. They're white cut paper strips, and they're actually glue. And those are to help glue down large stems and branches for species that are very, very difficult to glue down to a piece of paper. Sometimes it can be much more difficult than is obvious to get like a branch glued to a piece of paper, and these extra details help. And then the brush is to brush the dirt off of the plant roots. And then you see an herbarium label here, excuse me, with all of the data, and we'll look at that in just a second. Okay, next slide. This is probably a lot more information about herbaria than may be needed, but you'd be surprised. For now, current science studies, many scientific publishers are requiring for plant studies, even research, or even if it's agricultural, they're requiring a mounted voucher specimen for the peer review publication. It's becoming a much more important thing. Even with growing medicinal plants and growing various crops, a lot of farmers and growers are being required to maintain voucher specimen collections to prove the DNA population of that particular species per year. So it's becoming a much more common theme, even in growers and in science. And it makes sense because it proves without a shadow of doubt what that plant species is as a sample of DNA, so that you can prove what that plant was at that time. Herbarium cabinets also are an important part of the storage of the voucher specimens. Excuse me. They're sealed to protect the samples from insect infestation. Insect infestation is the biggest problem with herbarium collections. If insects get into that cabinet, they can wipe out all of the plants and all of the samples. So there are some chemicals and some inserts that are recommended to put in the herbarium cabinet to keep the insects out. Okay, next slide, please. So voucher specimen preparation instructions. There are quite a few botanical gardens in the U.S. that have excellent access to directions for making herbarium specimens, and they're all updated to 2020 and 2022. So Kew Botanical Garden, which is the second largest botanical garden in the world, has a very good data about making herbarium specimens. And the University of Florida, excuse me, the University of Florida Herbarium also has a very good publication on preparation of plant specimens for deposit as herbarium vouchers. Next slide. And one thing that really does need to be stressed is that with the natural products industry and with farmers and growers, the use of voucher specimens to prove a crop or prove even a product is becoming more and more common, and we'll be seeing that growing quite a bit in the future. So other sources, taxonomic identification sources, this is for keying out the species correctly before making a label. And we have the flora of the southeastern United States, which is Alan Weekly's flora. And it is the best key to key out to species for our region. And it is totally free and it's downloadable from the UNC website. I highly recommend it for identifying species in our region. It's the Bible for botanists. We also have Godfrey and Wooten's Aquatic and Wetland Plants of Southeastern US. And that's a 2-volume, over 1,600 pages, but that's an incredibly good resource also for keying out the wetland plants. The first source to go to is usually Weekly's Flora for keying out, and that's for all native plants in the Southeast. I highly recommend it. Okay, next slide. And then also the herbarium labels, the preparation of those. There are various methods to use for this. I normally use an automated method that takes an Excel spreadsheet and turns that into the label using a database. But you can also develop a 4 label per page system where you fill in the label if you don't collect as many vouchers as a full herbarium. And the herbarium labels include the genus, species, and family, who the collectors are. They're assigned a field collection number. Usually we use the federal NPGS method, which is the first 2 initials of the collector, the year, the month, and then the numbered sample collected. So this is Joanne McCoy, 2022, September, and that's the 12th sample collected. The date of the collection goes on the label, the location, the county and state, the GPS coordinates and the elevation, the habitat, associated species, and then also the Cherokee name is optional, can be added to the herbarium labels. Next slide, please. And this is an example of an herbarium label. And this will be the label for the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indian Water Quality Herbarium. And it shows you the family, the genus, species, the date, the common name, the county, the town, elevation, habitat, latitude, longitude, datum, directions, plant associates, collector, and then also who else the collectors are with them. Next slide, please. The wetland indicator status, if it's a wetland species, is a very valuable information also to put on a herbarium label. If it's an obligate, if it's a facultative wetland plant, or facultative plants or facultative upland plants. This is actually being highly encouraged now to be added to the herbarium label. Next slide, please. So the stages are acquisition and exploration, and this is when all the passport data is collected in the field. All the data you saw on the label, GPS coordinates, and a plant sample is collected and pressed. Some people carry the press into the field with them, and some people don't like to carry it. I prefer to carry the press with me to get a better sample. When you store the plant material in bags and then press it when you get to your car, it ruins your samples quite often. So I think it's actually a better idea to do the pressing in the field. Next slide, please. The herbarium specimens, they're a valuable resource for education and long-term storage. And high-resolution scanned images are prepared from them. And what happens is if you have a high-resolution scanner, you'll have this sample forever, and it'll never be, just in case something happened to your herbarium, if you have a scanned image also and it's high resolution, if the resolution is high enough that you can zoom in on the flower and key it out, like this is Xanthorrhiza simplissima, it's an invaluable asset to add this. So a lot of herbariums don't have the scanners to scan the photos, and you can also set up a photographic table with a 35mm camera on a stem, and then take pictures that way too. But we highly recommend taking the photographs also. And then here in the upper right, this is a plant press dryer, and these are necessary when you harvest the herbarium vouchers. It's necessary that they get dried so that they don't form mold or get insect infested. So it's highly recommended to use a dryer or use a small side room with a dehumidifier so that the plants dry 100%, so there's no mold or insect issues. Okay, next slide. And this is an example of a herbarium sample, and you'll notice that this is Caulophyllum selectroides. When you press the sample, you want flower or fruit, and this one you can see has the fruit. You want, when you press the leaves, you turn one upside down. You can see here on the far left, the leaf is upside down, the rest are upside. And that's so that when you key it out, you can see more information, and then you also have the root. And as much information as possible so that you have enough to key out the sample to species. And then this is when you do the photograph and the scan, there's also a range around the photo, and then there's also the photo color chart. It's the Munsell color chart to preserve accuracy with time. Next slide, please. Here's another sample, and can everybody tell what this is? Kudzu? Not a very rare plant. This is just another example of a herbarium voucher sample and how to spread it out. You see the top of the leaf, the bottom, you have flower, you have fruit, you even have stem. The stem's cut in half, so you can see the internal part of the stem, and that all aids with keying out to species. Next slide. Here's another one, and in this you can see that this is Echium. You can see in the top the FTA plant card. That's a DNA sample. So those are the plant cards where you can rub the leaf when you have the fresh sample. You can grind it into those 4 squares, and you have 4 DNA samples there for future research. And then you can see the side envelope here also has a flower and seed in it. And this all helps you with future identification or future research. In the past, when people wanted to take DNA samples from these vouchers, they were just going in and taking them off the whole plant. And oftentimes it destroys your sample. So we highly recommend the FTA plant cards. And then here on the left, this is a scanner, and this is the scanner that scans the herbarium specimens. It's specifically designed for the specific size of an herbarium sheet. Next slide. Data management is a big part of an herbarium and a seed bank. We are working with Cherokee to set up this herbarium, but also we're going to add a seed bank also. And so for every specimen that we've collected in the flowering stage, we'll go back when that plant is in seed stage and harvest the seed, and then add that to a seed bank using the NPGS, which is the National Plant Germplasm System. It's the federal system. It's the best long-term system for seed storage. And we'll be using that method. We'll also be doing germination studies on the seed and expanding the program to include the germplasm repository also. Next slide, please. As we saw with the last talk, it was very interesting. climate change is an issue, and in the future, saving these seeds and verifying these plant species presence is going to become more and more important. And I think it's going to be going to become far more common for people to be developing seed banks, long-term seed banks, using the Nordic seed bank method and the National Plant Germplasm System method, which is the method that we will be using in Cherokee. And we would like to see this expand and grow before it's too late. I do want to show, it's kind of interesting that you see where the UCIT boundaries are, which is the Eastern North America. What's kind of interesting, if you compare the UCIT territory to the vascular plant richness map here in the upper left, and you see it sort of matches the UCIT boundaries. And then also, if you go down one, you'll see the portion of North America that was unglaciated throughout the last 3 ice ages, which is our region of the Appalachian chain. This was the portion of North America that was not under ice when the rest was. And again, you see that matches the UCIT territory. And then down here, if you also look at the biological importance index, you see that same boundary. It's interesting, and it's also the UCIT. So I wonder if the tribes were just really smart, and when the rest of the continent was under ice, they were in the unglaciated portion. It's kind of interesting. But these boundaries are the boundaries that we would like to work on the most and get as many seeds in the seed bank as possible. Next slide, please. Zone creep is another issue that is coming up, and they're saying that the plant hardiness zones are creeping up and getting warmer. And so the growth zones that we're in now might not be the same growth zone that we're in 10 or 15 years. This makes this even more important to get these seeds into a seed bank as soon as possible before we lose the parent plant. And this data came from the National Climate Data Center in Asheville, compiled from 7,000 weather stations. And the growth zones are higher at 40% of these stations. And they're afraid that that might continue and to increase the zone creep. Next slide. And with that, I'm going to end, and I'll be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Joanne. I think you hit it on the head early on. There's so much more to an herbarium than I originally thought, and it's really important and valuable work. So it was great to get a really in-depth look at that. Can we take maybe one question from the group? I see some messages in the chat, and then we'll move on to the next one.
I have a question. When you're digitalizing and scanning in these herbarium collections, is there any microscopy that you're doing for like the small, like flowering parts or fruits?
Yes, definitely. Actually, I've done microscopy looking at cells to identify species too, but we definitely use a compound and dissecting microscopes to key out the plant sometimes. And I didn't mention also that there's a whole new other area of research involving endophytes. Endophytes are the microbes that live inside all of these plants, and they're finally getting recognized. They're not pathogens, they're beneficial to the plant. And we actually use the microscope, and I isolate the microbes from the plants and look at those too. And we definitely use compounding and dissecting microscopes looking at the plants. And I think the endophyte stuff is going to go viral in the future, pardon the pun there. But the microbes inside the plants are turning out to be far more important than anybody knew.
Wow, that's awesome. Thank you, Joanne.
Yeah, thank you, Joanne. I'm going to pass it along now to our next presentation, which is going to be Patricia Leopold with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. Patricia, do you want to go ahead and kick off your, oh, there we go. Awesome. The floor is yours, Patricia.
Okay, well, thanks. Thanks, everybody. I'm not going to share my camera during this presentation. I have a slight cold and opted to work from home today, so I think I'll save my bandwidth and hope that the slides will continue to be high quality for you. So I'm going to give an overview today of our adaptation menus and other tools that go along with those menus that are focused on incorporating climate change into land stewardship. And I'm cooperating with Bazil, who is going to follow my talk and dive even deeper into some of these tools and resources. So just in case you're not familiar with our organization, NIACS, or the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, is a multi-institutional partnership. So we're primarily led by the Forest Service, and we get support from Region 9, the Northern Research Station, and we work across all 3 of the deputy areas. So the National Forest System, state and private forestry, and also research and development. And our mission is to support and provide applied ecological, economic, social, and cultural information that can be used in climate adaptation and forest carbon management. So I'm one of a team of adaptation specialists at NIACS, and some of you may have worked really closely with some of our other specialists before, including Stephen Handler, who works a lot in the Northwoods, Maria Genoviak, who works in New England, myself, who primarily works in the Central Appalachians and Mid-Atlantic, Kristen Schmidt, who has been on the Tribal Adaptation Menu team, and also Danielle Shannon, who is our Northern Forest Hub coordinator, but is also just a wealth of information about hydrologic issues. So you may have run into a few of us before. And one of our flagship projects is the Climate Change Response Framework. So this is a collaborative effort among scientists, managers, and landowners across the region to incorporate climate change into natural resource management, really working at both the site and the landscape level. So this framework really came about by the Forest Service recognizing that climate change is not just a Forest Service problem, but it requires a response that goes beyond boundaries and beyond disciplines. And so the framework is a product of 4 components that really support it. The first one is those partnerships between researchers, managers, academic institutions, on the ground land managers, researchers, and anyone else who has a vested interest in land stewardship. Another component is vulnerability assessment. So we've broken up the Northeast United States into 9 separate ecoregions, and really took a look at how the climate is changing in those regions, what are the implications for major forest ecosystems within that region, and then published all of that information into these ecoregional vulnerability assessments. And we also have a similar process for working in urban areas. The third component is adaptation resource. And this is where I'm going to focus my talk on today. So this is a adaptation workbook that guides managers through a stepwise process to take those vulnerability assessments and then decide what they can do to minimize climate change risks and impacts. Another product in our adaptation resources toolkit is the adaptation menus, and I'll talk a bit more about those. And then finally, the fourth component of our framework is over 500 case studies of land managers, land stewards, who have used the adaptation workbook and the adaptation menus to focus in on their particular place on the landscape with all of their goals and the ecosystem types that they're working in, and then figure out what are those adaptation strategies that they're going to incorporate into their management plan. So there's a number of these demonstrations that are available online, and I'll talk a little bit more about those, but you can go to that website and you can look up how other folks in different situations have tackled climate change and are working toward making their ecosystems more resistant, resilient, or in line with climate change. So diving into the adaptation workbook and adaptation resources, when we started developing adaptation resources, our first thought was that, we would come out with this nifty guidebook of how to do adaptation. It would provide all of the answers on all of the ecosystems and what you needed to do, and how to do it. But in our early days working with land management partners on the landscape, we figured out pretty quickly that this was a big failure because of the diversity of values on the landscape, the diversity of ecosystems, and then even the resources that are available to different ownership types. And the big takeaway from that is that there is no silver bullet or one size fits all for adaptation. So the NIAX adaptation resources package, it really addresses these diverse needs. So we present the adaptation workbook and the adaptation menus. And these are two components that are designed to work hand in hand to address landowner needs. The workbook was really designed to be flexible enough to accommodate those diverse goals and land ownerships. And most typically, the workbook is used at a project level and centers on the manager's expertise and judgment, and can really help managers just clarify and articulate how they have intentionally considered climate change in their management plans. So as a rule, the workbook itself does not make recommendations. Rather, it's a tool that creates a platform for managers to first take credit for all of the good work that is being done already, and second, creates an opportunity for managers to recognize new approaches to dealing with climate-related threats and vulnerabilities. So the adaptation workbook is really this 5-step cycle. We call it a workbook because we actually have handouts, worksheets that we provide to folks during training events. And the first step is to just define your location, your objectives, your ecosystem type, and your time frame. So this provides the user to really identify, what is meaningful about the area that they're working in. The second step of the workbook is to assess climate change impacts and vulnerabilities. And this is where those ready-made vulnerability assessments come in really handy. They can go to specific ecosystem types and get information about how climate change is affecting the drivers and the species and the hydrology and other ecosystem processes. The third step is then assuming you know what you know about climate change impacts on the site that you're working in. How do those climate change impacts affect your ability to meet your management goals and objectives? So what are the challenges associated with climate change? What are the opportunities there? And then in the fourth step of the workbook, that's where we get into the good stuff. So we can use those menus of adaptation strategies and approaches to jumpstart this brainstorming about what are the actions that we can take to address those challenges and opportunities or minimize those risks and impacts. And then finally, the fifth step is to just identify how you're going to monitor your progress toward meeting your management goals and objectives, and your effectiveness in doing so. And I mentioned that we have adaptation demonstrations that are real world examples of folks who have gone through this process and have selected adaptation actions and really specific tactics that they're using in their management plans. And so more than 170 of these are described online. You can go in and you can sort by state, you can sort by ownership type, and I think there's a couple other ways that you can sort through these projects if you're looking for something specific. So adaptation planning, when we get into the adaptation menus, again, most managers aren't really looking for rules or prescriptions. They're looking for tools that support flexibility and decision making. They're looking to connect climate adaptation concepts to a discipline of natural resource management, and go on to further describe exactly what needs to be done in order to meet those adaptation concepts. And so, again, folks are managing ecosystems from a variety of perspectives. So wildlife habitat could be one angle. Sustainable forest management could be another angle. Recreation. So there's, probably 10 more that you can think of. And so these adaptation planning tools are trying to really provide that flexibility in order to meet the needs of all of these different perspectives on the ground. So what is an adaptation menu? So this is really a collection of plausible adaptation actions. They're specific to a discipline. So for example, forestry, although I'll show you additional menus in just a minute. They're organized into a tiered hierarchy. And so each of these menus are really starting with a strategy, which can be broad and applicable to many different system types, but really has a good path forward. And then within a strategy, it also contains a number of more specific approaches. In other words, how would you tackle management in order to accomplish that strategy? And then finally, the most specific action is a tactic, which can be that what, where, how, and when kind of details. So the menu is really thorough and comprehensive, and sometimes even include what's to be opposing ideas. The idea is that you wouldn't choose everything on the menu, just like, you wouldn't go out to eat and pick everything on the menu. You would only pick and choose the things that are really necessary to meet your current needs. And so getting from your broad goals to your actions, these menus are really helping create a clear rationale for your actions by connecting your actions to broader adaptation ideas that connect to specific climate change impacts. And here is the hierarchy that I described. You start with broad concepts of resistance, resilience, and transition. And then you have broad strategies, more specific approaches, finally actions, tactics that lead you straight into actions. And so there's a number of adaptation frameworks that lay out conceptual options for responding to climate change. And I believe Adam mentioned the RAD framework. Another similar framework is the resistance, resilience, and transition framework, which was described by Connie Millar and others in a 2007 paper in Ecological Applications. So these options really help to set your intention in terms of how much change is acceptable or required. So resistance usually works best in the short term. It's dedicated to resisting disturbance to a system for as long as possible. Resilience enables a system to tolerate and recover from disturbance. So actions under resilience would be those that support a system to better tolerate and recover from disturbance. And then transition fundamentally changes a system and realigns it with a more tolerable level or type of disturbance, as is currently or expected to occur in the near future. Sorry, I'm missing my cues for the pictures here. Strategies are also just more specific ways of practicing those options of resistance, resilience, and transition. So here we've listed the 10 strategies from the forest menu to illustrate that they're organized roughly with resistance first, then resilience, and then transition. But you can see that there's a lot of gray area as well, which makes sense because what might be resilience to one landowner in their situation might be a transition action to another landowner in a different situation. And that's, you know, when it boils down to it, it's all about that user's experience and what makes sense for them. Brief summary here, the forest adaptation resource document contains menu each for natural forests and urban forests that are published in our guide. But since we published the FAR, or the forest adaptation resources, we've worked with various partners to address resource areas that are important to them. So we now have menus for also forested watersheds, tribal perspective, agriculture, forest carbon management, the list goes on. And then we also have in preparation menus for grassland and ocean coastal ecosystems. And any of these can be swapped out and used with that adaptation workbook process to meet you where you are. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Bazil, who's going to dive a little bit deeper into the tribal perspectives adaptation menu.
Awesome, thank you. There's been some awesome presentations so far, and really enjoyed them. I'm also excited to hear from all of you. So I'm going to share my presentation, figure out how to share my screen here.
Okay,
All right, you should be able to see the screen.
we're seeing your screen. It's not in presentation mode yet.
Awesome. Okay, should be
Perfect.
now.
Looks good.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah, well, bonjour. Hello, everyone. My name is Bazil Panik. I introduced myself a little bit earlier. Work for the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, TAM coordinator, so sharing this resource that I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to start off by saying that my presentation is titled Toboggan Jagadig Anishinaabe Asia Twad, a tribal climate adaptation menu for indigenous-led climate adaptation. So this is Toboggan Jagadig Anishinaabe Asia Twad. It's an adaptation planning tool for tribes and non-tribal partners who currently or want to work with tribal communities. It was realized that there was a need for an adaptation menu, just like the NIACS workbook and menus. There's a need for one that emphasizes traditional and tribal perspectives. Like our past presenter mentioned, that it can be adapted to anyone's ecosystem or different biodiversity. For us with the tribal adaptation menu, we're adapting to different tribal perspectives. The title Toboggan Jagadig Anishinaabe Asia Twad came from a conversation with elders in different communities about how there can't really be an accurate translation for tribal climate adaptation menu. It's a little more scientific. So the Ojibwe language, elders informed us that a good way to explain what this menu does is doing things the Anishinaabe way. So doing things from Anishinaabe are the indigenous people surrounding the Great Lakes region. So doing things under the way that we believe to be traditional, our traditional cultural practices, or speaking the language, or understanding our histories. This is the tribal adaptation menu team. We have a lot of organizations that help to author this menu. Those are our specific authors in the left on this within the circle. And we decided to place the authors within the circle to kind of avoid the usual Western hierarchical authorship. The way authorship is displayed is kind of the first author is the one who contributed the most. But we realized that, we realized that each person had a huge role, no matter how many words they said in the production of this menu, and wanted to be recognized in this way. We've won 2 awards so far for our tribal adaptation menu, and you can see them displayed there. I have one above my desk there. The one on the right, I'm not sure where that is, so I might have to find that award and where that's at. But so climate change and tribes, what's the relationship between tribal communities and the effects of climate change? I think everybody's pretty familiar that there are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States, 60 state recognized tribes, and countless other tribes that have been disenfranchised by US government policy and action. Each of them have their own climate change story. I'm glad floods were mentioned so much, and precipitation. These are photos from 2016 when the Bad River tribal community in northern Wisconsin experienced some major flooding and really impacted even this highway system, where it was kind of the only way in and out of the reservation. So climate change will not only affect have physical effects on tribal communities like flooding, but it also will have an effect on our ability to meet spiritual, ceremonial, medicinal, subsistence, and economic needs that our tribal communities have. This could disrupt our cultural lifeways, which we've held on to for hundreds of thousands of years. So climate change could and does create some of these losses of these needs. So it's important in our climate adaptation because of the intricacies of our cultural and traditional relationships with the land to make a specific tribal climate adaptation menu. So this was primarily developed for the use by Indigenous communities and our non-tribal partners that are working with tribal communities. And this helps to bridge communication barriers, also offer specific climate adaptation strategies and approaches for those non-tribal persons or the tribal peoples and Indigenous approaches to climate adaptation. Designed to be used across a diversity of ecosystems, scales, management contexts, and values, can be adapted elsewhere. So this is the first version of the menu. This is based on Ojibwe and Menominee perspectives, so 2 of the nations that belong under the Anishinaabe Nation. But it was intentionally designed to be adaptable by other indigenous communities. We're working with some Southwest tribes right now to create their own adaptation menu. And this allows for the incorporation of their specific languages, their specific knowledge, and cultural intricacies. One of the larger sections of the tribal adaptation menu and can almost serve as a standalone resource is the guiding principles. This begins the menu in sharing some principles to follow for the non-tribal organizations in ethical engagement with tribal communities. So it's a framework to integrate indigenous and traditional knowledge, culture, language, and history into climate adaptation planning, provides that guidance for non-tribal partners, like I mentioned, while focusing and emphasizing empowering tribal communities, restoring our language and culture, and promoting tribal sovereignty overall. Our suggestion is any climate adaptation processes emphasize the promotion of tribal sovereignty and all of the things that I mentioned. I want to mention some of our tribal adaptation menu strategies and approaches. Overall, there are 14 strategies, 50 plus approaches, and 100 plus example tactics included in the TAM tribal adaptation menu that were developed through focus group discussions, workshops with natural resource professionals, and then also based off of NIAX's workbook that was really helpful in the creation of our TAM. For time's sake, I just want to emphasize strategies 1 through 3. These are incorporated into most, if not all, tribal adaptation menu projects that go through this process. Strategy 1 is consider cultural practices and seek spiritual guidance. The inclusion of elders or knowledge holders in different communities is emphasized in any climate adaptation process, though they might not be formal scientists, they're scientists in their own right. Strategy 2 is learned through careful and respectful observation. A lot of the time, Western science wants to act quickly and under our own knowledge that we're already carrying, when Anishinaabe perspectives believe it's important to kind of sit back sometimes and observe and learn from the environment, because we believe that the environment is our teachers. Strategy 3 is support tribal engagement in the environment, revitalize traditional relationships like harvesting wild rice or engaging in the sugar bush, harvesting maple sap to make into syrup. So those are strategies 1 through 3 of the 14 menu strategies that are really important, but I strongly encourage you to look at the rest of the strategies as well. So we take the tribal adaptation menu and host workshops that uses the 5-step process in the workbooks or in the worksheets from NIAX that are really helpful. It's usually a 2.5-day workshop that we put together, take them through each step while always emphasizing an Indigenous perspective. Usually we have about 5 or 6 projects that people bring, or if they attend without a project, they get paired up with one wherever they're interested in. To date, the TAM has been used with 41 different projects across the United States, Midwest, Northeast, and beyond. Again, it's adaptable to every community. Here's a quick example that I'd like to share of a successful tribal adaptation menu project. So a project that went through our TAM workshop process, 2 different workshops, and a lot of often communication with the person who was doing this project. The TAM team discussed different ways to go about completing this project quite a bit in the past few years. So it's an interactive website that talks about climate vulnerabilities in the Apostle Islands while emphasizing Ojibwe ecological knowledge and bringing more culturally relevant perspectives on how climate change is affecting the Apostle Islands in northern Wisconsin. I think that's a really successful project and encourage you to check it out. It's minnesun.org. Really interactive and fun and very educational. So here are some activities we're doing this year to continue to share the TAM. We're developing train the trainer workshops to build out our workshop facilitator capacity. Currently working with the Forest Service to create workshops surrounding the Tribal Forest Protection Act of 2004 to bridge the gap between Forest Service and tribal communities. As I mentioned, we're having discussions with tribes in the Southwest to create their own tribal climate adaptation menu. So I think that's a quick run through of the tribal adaptation menu, and I hope you learned something from my presentation. There's my email there if you want to contact me, and then a link to how you can access the tribal adaptation menu. You can also order a physical copy through glyphwic.org and under educational materials. So yeah, I hope that was a quick run through and that you learned something. And Miigwech, thank you.
Ali, thank you, Bazil. That was great. We love to share and hear more about the tribal adaptation menu at all of our USET climate events because it's such a great resource. I want to let everyone know I'm aware of the time. We're coming close to the 4 o'clock mark when this webinar is supposed to wrap up. And so I wanted to let everyone know that if you have to peel off for some other commitment, totally understand and don't feel like you're out of place by doing so. I do want to pin everybody that presented, and same to the presenters. If you have to run because 4 o'clock is rolled around, that's totally fine. Completely understand. But if you are sticking around, I'd like to put you up here for the panel discussion, and anybody in the group that has a question for any of our presenters, including Bazil and Patricia, who just presented, please unmute yourself and turn your camera on and ask that, or throw it into the chat. And so let's kick off the panel portion of today's webinar.
I just wanted to add, basically based on Dr. Tarando's presentation. Here, I'm actually in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, and we see a lot of localized and regional flooding, even with smaller rain events. Daily rain events of maybe an inch or so. So we see a lot of flooding because we've lost a lot of riparian areas due to development and agriculture. And the concerning aspect of this is our 100-year floods are coming quicker and quicker and quicker. So we see these significant events on a regular basis. And the largest issue with that is not only the runoff, but we are the Chesapeake Bay watershed, one of the watersheds. So, everything that happens here eventually winds up affecting coastal waters and other wetland areas as well. So it was a great presentation, Dr. Tarando. I appreciate it, and I enjoyed everybody else as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Really appreciate that. Thank you for adding that important perspective as well. Thanks. And I do apologize. I'm going to have to take off, but I really appreciate all the presentations. They were all great, and really enjoyed being here and being able to engage with you all. So thanks, Tyler and Casey and everyone, for putting this together and for the invitation.
Thank you, Adam.
Yes, thank you, Adam.
Bye.
Take care. Are there other questions from the group for the rest of the panelists that are here? All right, I have a few prepared panel questions for everyone. And so if anyone has a thought on these questions, feel free to jump in. So it's to everyone. Wetland spaces have so many gifts to offer us, gifts that are rich with traditional knowledge, when considering adaptation strategies and approaches in the work that we do, how does that change how we interact with these places and the people that know these spaces in the work that we do? How do we engage in that traditional knowledge in a respectful way?
I'll jump in here for this one. Wetlands in our area are traditionally known for, we call them the Anishinaabe pharmacy, or like an indigenous pharmacy. There's a lot of wetlands are known for just their abundance of medicinal plants, and in any adaptation, I strongly think that any traditional harvesters, the people that are out in the wetlands harvesting medicines or interacting with that environment, should be included in the conversations regarding climate adaptation projects, to increase participation of just community in the scientific work, but also to emphasize those traditional perspectives.
Yeah, thank you, Bazil. I think the tribal adaptation menu guiding principles do a good job too of talking about, at least from an Anishinaabe perspective, how that might be carried out. And I think that as we learn in our own communities, I know of ways in which I would approach certain people up here in the land of the dawn to make sure I'm being respectful and engaging with that space in the right way. And then another thought that I had here when we talk about plant herbariums, seed banking, and climate change. I hear a lot about assisted migration in the forested setting, but when we think about wetland spaces, is assisted migration a strategy we can think about in these spaces? Is that something that people here on the panel have given some thought to and want to share some thoughts on?
Well, I think that it's definitely possible. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Joanne. Yep.
I think that it's probably a good idea, and I think anything we do to pay attention to the issues at hand is more positive than negative.
Mhm.
And so I definitely think it's something we want to think about and work towards.
Thank you, Joanne. And then I guess to wrap up the panel in the interest of time, and while we still have people on the call, is there any key lessons from the group that you think you'd like to share with everyone on the call when it comes to adapting to climate change planning, and the use of some of these tools that we've talked about, or projects similar to what Joanne and Heather have presented on?
I'd like to jump in. There were a number of excellent tools that were presented on today's call. Some of them were for specific purposes, while others were just more general approaches to climate change. In the end, it really doesn't matter which one you pick, as long as you're keeping your eyes open to what's going on around you and coming up with a plan to address some of these new conditions that we're seeing and new impacts that we're seeing. So it's definitely not an issue where these are competing resources, but it's more of a build your own library and use the best tools that will work for you.
Thank you, Patricia. Does anyone else have a lesson to leave with the group from today's webinar session?
I would input one comment that whatever happens to the plants happens to the people. And we need to remember that we can't live without them. They can probably live great without us. So it's time to step up and work on saving the plants, because saving the plants is going to save the people. And it's smart. It just makes sense. It's not rocket science. And I think with climate change, it's going to get, I think it's pretty obvious it'll get worse, not better. So we need to be smart and save the plants, save the planet.
Well said, Joanne. Okay, well, thank you very much, panelists, and for your presentations. It was great. For all of you, if you have copies of your slides and you can share them with me, I'd love to get that out to everyone that was registered for the event. I'd also like to share along any resources that you mentioned in your presentation, so I can dive into those for the links, or if you can send them to me in an email, that would be great. I'm going to share my exit slides here real quick. So if you are doing the incentive checklist, there were 3 prompts for today. We don't have the time allowable to break off and do that today. But one thing I learned from today's webinar was the first one. And then there are 2 that are specific to the presentations we saw today. In the presentation by Heather Gregory and Joanne McCoy, Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians Wetlands Project, Joanne and Heather introduced a wetlands herbarium project with big aspirations. What can a plant herbarium project like the one shared do to support climate resilience and wetland restoration projects? And then in follow-up to the presentations by the Tribal Adaptation Menu team and NIAX, do you have a project that you think could benefit from using the adaptation menus they shared? If so, what project? And which adaptation menu do you think would be a good fit? So if you guys can take those questions and give them some thought, feel free to send me your writing reflections to my email at teverett@usetinc.org. So Wallah Lee, thank you everyone for participating in today's webinar. I'm looking forward to the rest of the webinars in this series. We're kind of coming up on the tail end now. I think we will all share in some good conversations in the last 2 webinars we have in this series. The next webinar is the Alabama Coshada Tribe of Texas Longleaf Pine Restoration Efforts. That will occur next Monday, September 12th from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. Central. And I hope to see all of you there. If you have any reflections that you would like to get typed up, again, you can send those to my email. And this concludes the 4th webinar in the USET Forest and Wetlands webinar training series. Thank you all for joining, Wallah Ali, and thank you to all of our presenters and panelists.
Good job, Tyler.
Thanks, Joanne. Good job to you. I'm glad I was able to flick through all of your slides very
Yes,
smoothly.
that worked well. That was great.
All right. Casey, are you still on the call? All right, I'm gonna hang on until I can get a hold of Casey because he's got the recording. But everyone else is free to go. Again, thank you for joining, and thank you to those who were able to present today. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Tyler.
Thank you, Bazil. Hello. Hey, Casey, how are you? Hmm. Oh, no. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, I think it went really well. I we were a little off on time to start, but I think things kind of caught up there at the end, and we didn't have as much time to talk at the end, but that's because we had such great long presentations